Hello, everyone. We'll get started in just a minute. All right. I'm going to invite the speakers to turn on their cameras, and we're going to get started right on time because there's so much we want to get through. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today from wherever you are. We appreciate you taking an hour out of your day to hear about our report, Collective Action Reimagined, a call for fair process and supplier inclusion in fashion's multi-stakeholder initiatives. Ooh, that's a mouthful. I don't know if I've ever said it in one go like that. The report launched on Monday, and this is our official launch webinar for it. I'm going to introduce the speakers in a moment, but before I do that, Rubia, if you could go to the next slide. So I've already said the name of the report, but it is basically about insights into the systemic and structural barriers that prevent manufacturer engagement and inclusion within multi-stakeholder organizations, and about how this undermines our collective progress. And in this presentation, we're going to highlight key findings. We're going to talk about what the fair process model is and what it means for multi-stakeholder organizations, and also how other stakeholders can be more effective allies. From a structural perspective, we're going to start. I'm going to introduce everyone, and then I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth Klein, who will take you through the key findings and what we're suggesting for the fair process model, and then we'll open up for a discussion with a number of people involved in the report, and then we'll go to audience Q&A. So if you do have questions, please feel free to put them in the Q&A box as we go along. We'll do our best to get to them at the end, and if we don't, then we can always reach out to you and answer via email. Rubia, next slide, please. So a bit about Transformers Foundation before we get started. Transformers Foundation is the unified voice representing the denim industry and its ideas for positive change. We were founded to provide a thus far missing platform to the jeans and denim supply chain and a central point of contact for all the different types of entities who want to learn more about ethics and sustainable innovation in the denim industry. And our founders, we really are a supply chain driven foundation, and our founders represent all the way from cotton farming through to chemical suppliers, through to denim mills and jeans factories, and beyond. So next slide, please, Rubia. If you haven't downloaded the report, I encourage you to do so, and you can kind of follow along as Elizabeth speaks to different points. So please do download the report. We're going to be touching at a very high level today, and there's so much in there that we can't possibly get into in this short presentation. So I really encourage you to download the report. Next slide, please, Rubia. So the speakers. So we have quite a big group here today. We have, I'm going to do these out of sequence. I apologize, but I'm going to start with Elizabeth. So Elizabeth is the author of the report. She's an independent researcher and writer, and she is also a lecturer at Columbia University in New York. And this report really is a testament and a credit to her. And she did all of the research for this report as well. So thank you, Elizabeth, for being with us here today. We're also joined by Alicio Lovejoy. And Alicio is an independent researcher, and she published her master's dissertation at Cambridge on tensions within fashion's multi-stakeholder organizations, and her research focused specifically on Cascale. And it was really, she was the first to apply this fair process model, which you'll learn more about in the presentation, to the multi-stakeholder setting. And she joins us today. Really, she was an advisor on the report and joins us as an expert on fair process. So looking forward to hearing from her during the discussion. And then we're also joined by Alberto De Conti. So Alberto De Conti is part of Rudolph Group. Alberto was interviewed for the report and is here kind of from the perspective of chemical manufacturers. And he is also on the steering committee for Transformers Foundation, and Rudolph Group is one of the founders of Transformers Foundation. We're also joined by Noreen Muzaffar of Crescent Bahuman. Noreen was also interviewed for the report, and Crescent Bahuman is a denim mill in Pakistan. And Crescent Bahuman is also one of the founders of Transformers Foundation. And last but not least, we're joined by Tricia Carey, who has been on the supply chain side of this picture for many, many, many years and has engaged in these issues in a lot of different positions, one of which is she's on the steering committee of Transformers Foundation. And as somebody who has decades of experience working in the supply chain, she was also interviewed for the report. So thank you to all of you for being here with us today. And I'm gonna, Rubia, next slide. Yeah, thank you. I'm gonna tell you briefly why as Transformers Foundation we picked this topic for our report this year, and then I'm gonna hand over to Elizabeth for the presentation. So you see here on screen the covers of a bunch of different reports that Transformers has been involved in over the years, and to be honest, there's more. We couldn't even fit them all on this slide. But as we were reflecting on these reports and what they had in common, because this is the fifth, Transformers Foundation was founded in 2020. So this is the fifth time that we're doing a sort of deep dive Transformers-led report. And we were thinking, like, we've written about cotton, we've written about chemical certification, we've written about climate action. What do these legislation, what do all of these reports have in common? And there was one thing that really stood out to us, and that was that, you know, kind of regardless of the thematic topic, what we were finding in report after report was that the right stakeholders, in other words, the manufacturers, the supply chain, hadn't had enough voice in shaping whatever solution the industry had kind of landed on. And so, and that this was not only unjust, but also what was making these strategies and these solutions ineffective. And so we started to think about, well, where do these strategies come from? How does fashion decide that its approach to chemicals management is going to be an RSL list or chemical certifications? How does fashion decide that its approach to climate action is going to be science-based targets and decarbonization? How do these sustainability strategies become sort of the go-to approach for the industry? And we decided to look at MSIs within this question, within these sort of questions, because although MSIs aren't always the ones to create these approaches or standards, they play a really key role in galvanizing the industry around a certain approach. And so we thought, well, maybe we could do a report that looks at how these MSIs work. How do we end up with such ubiquitous and widespread solutions premised on a sort of particular rather than shared understanding of the problem, and one that doesn't tend to resonate with manufacturers? And so that is why we ended up with this topic. And with that, I'm going to hand over to Elizabeth, and I'll invite the other speakers to turn their cameras off, and I'll invite you to turn them back on when we get to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Kim. And thanks everybody for being here. It's really, I just am so happy to see so many people who've logged in to participate in the discussion and to learn more about the findings from the report. And this has truly been a collective effort, and it's really wonderful to be here in conversation with so many people that played such a pivotal role in the development of this report, including, of course, Kim, who is, as always, underplaying her own role, and just how the kind of like depth and framing of where we've landed with this report. So I have the honor of walking you through a 114-page report in 20 minutes. So I'm just going to get going. We set out to do a couple of things with this report. The first is that we wanted to examine the pivotal role that multi-stakeholder initiatives play in driving sustainability within the fashion industry, and the degree to which MSIs engage their key stakeholders, so specifically manufacturers. There's, of course, been a lot of prior research on and coverage of the outcomes of MSIs. Are they effective or not? But we really wanted to look at process. So what's going on behind the scenes in the day-to-day activities of MSIs that shapes and influences the degree to which they're effective and the degree to which they include the stakeholders they claim to represent. In terms of how we did the research, the report draws on qualitative methods, semi-structured interviews with manufacturers who have been actively engaged in MSI activities. If you have started to read the report, you know that we interviewed staff from 3 of the MSIs. All 4 of the MSIs that we talk about in the report were involved in a review process of the paper, and all of the initiatives were invited to contribute a response to the paper. And those who elected to do so, you can read the responses at the end of the report, and they've also been included throughout the report. So before we get going, what is a multi-stakeholder initiative? There's not a universal definition, but the way that we define it in the paper is that these are voluntary collaborations and platforms for engagement that bring together diverse stakeholders to solve complex global challenges. So by stakeholders, we mean, in this example, manufacturers, brands and retailers, civil society, academics. And something that I think that we're really trying to argue in the paper is that MSIs, because of their unique structure, can be really important change-making agents. As the World Bank puts it, MSIs often form around problems that no one party alone has the capacity, resources, or know-how to tackle. But there's a caveat, and what the paper is arguing is that for MSIs to reach that potential, that change-making potential, they have to effectively include and engage their key stakeholders. So that's really what the paper is looking at. So we evaluated 4 fashion multi-stakeholder initiatives. Why these 4? Well, first, let me say which 4. Cascale Sustainable, formerly the Sustainable Apparel Coalition, the Social and Labor Convergence Program, SLCP, ZDHC, and Textile Exchange. So as I was saying, why these 4? Well, part of it is because these 4 initiatives do have a large amount of influence in shaping the sustainability agenda in fashion. They've put out tools and standards that a lot of companies in the industry lean on. But they also all formally include manufacturers as members or signatories, and not all sustainability setting organizations in fashion do so. But we really do believe that the implications of this report extend far beyond these MSIs. And, you know, for resource reasons, we had to really narrow our scope, but we think that our findings are relevant to any entity setting sustainability standards. Okay, so kind of doing things a little out of order, but what did our findings show in general? It is difficult to boil it down, but we did find that for a combination of factors, both internal and external to MSIs, few manufacturers are actively or effectively engaged in multi-stakeholder initiatives, especially, and this is important, relative to more powerful and resource stakeholders like large brands and retailers. We see a potential for positive change, which is where the report kind of ends, by changing the rules of engagement, which I will get to in a minute. Okay, so next slide. So the one on structural and functional exclusion. In terms of how we organized our findings, we adapted the framework of Alicia Lovejoy, who is with us today. She's an independent researcher, and our paper is heavily indebted to her own research on MSI tensions. And we really used her framework of structural and functional factors to examine multi-stakeholder initiatives. So this might sound a little academic, but what we mean by structural and functional, I think the easiest way to think of it is structural are external systemic factors. They are things like, you know, geographic inequality that flows out of fashion's connections to colonialism and slavery. It has to do with the really large resource gaps between manufacturers and brands and retailers that flow out of power and financial imbalances in the supply chain. So those are things that are external to MSIs, but of course influence the way different individuals and companies within MSIs are able to engage. So in the resources and attitudes they show up to these groups with. Functional factors are everything internal to MSIs that are within their direct control. So that's things like, how do you structure your board of directors? What kind of decision-making rules do you have? What kind of voting structures do you use? You know, where are your annual meetings? How much are your membership fees? So all of those things that are really internal to MSIs. Okay, next slide. So what were the big findings on structural exclusion? Again, remember, structural is the external, the systemic that's influencing MSIs. One of the things that was just the strongest thing that we heard from many, many interviewees is that multi-stakeholder initiatives, especially when they're in the process of creating these standards, these sustainability tools and standards that come out of these organizations, take a lot of time and resources to develop, to send someone to working groups, to go to meetings, to read documents. And manufacturers, even ones that are very relatively well resourced, are really strained to send enough people into these groups and activities to the point where their voices are meaningfully heard. We were told that at most, there are maybe 10 manufacturing companies that are actively engaged in MSI activities, which means a large swath of the supply chain is just not being represented in these initiatives. And so suppliers and manufacturers are really having to pick and choose where to put their time and energy, leaving a lot of people out of the conversation. We also looked at how implicit bias, racism, and privileging of global North norms, values, and perspectives shaped MSIs. And we really did feel that, you know, even when MSIs were trying to be inclusive, a lot of manufacturers still feel they are not being valued and listened to equally. And it often feels specific to their race, ethnicity, or geography. And we recount a couple of examples in the report of instances of racial bias or implicit bias that happened years in the past, but because they were not properly remediated or accounted for, people are still carrying these harms with them. And that's a problem because it silences people and it discourages them from participating. Next slide, please. We can skip that just in the interest of time. Okay, so functional exclusion, again, these are the internal things, the things that are completely within MSI's control, like rules and norms, membership costs, things of this nature. I really encourage everyone to spend time in this section because there are appreciable differences in the way MSIs operate and kind of confer power to their members. But the two major findings that we found in this section, one is that although the number of manufacturers who are included as members of MSIs has increased over time, this isn't necessarily an indicator of decision-making power. And so we heard a lot of different kind of stories from manufacturers about how decision-making power is distributed within MSIs. So there was a sense, for example, that within Cascale, over time, members have less decision-making power, and the organization has become more staff-driven over time. And SLCP, maybe by contrast, has always been kind of based on consensus-based decision making. But even in that context, it can be really difficult to overcome the bias towards brands and retailers, again, because those stakeholders have more resources and power to give to these organizations. Costs of participation. This is looking at things like membership fees, as well as, the cost to go to annual meetings. And these costs might seem relatively insignificant to a large brand or retailer, but they absolutely are making a lot of manufacturers and less resourced companies feel excluded. And one thing that I personally thought was interesting is it, again, left manufacturers in a position where they felt they had to pick and choose. So I can only participate in one group. So which of these groups am I going to have a voice in, and which one am I not going to have a voice in at all? Okay, next slide. All right, so how does functional and structural exclusion and tension work together to create a wider pattern of behavior? What we found is that structural and functional factors combine to create what we call, I believe it's called like the disengagement and burnout cycle, or something to that effect. What we found in general is that manufacturers still don't feel like MSI activities, they don't feel like they have agency over the goals and outcomes of these organizations. These organizations still feel very external to them, and a lot of the standards and products of these organizations still feel like something that is imposed on them rather than something that they're co-creating. They also, perhaps ironically, because there is the burden to comply with sustainability standards heavily falls on the supply chain. One of the reasons why they don't have equal resources to take into MSIs is because they're kind of having to contribute human resources to MSI activities, which leaves them fewer resources to participate in MSIs. I think there's also concern, or not, I think this is something that came through in the findings, that policy and regulations could potentially codify these more one-sided solutions that are kind of coming out of MSIs into law. And then finally, what we found is that a lot of manufacturers who have been participating from the beginning of MSIs, because there's so few of them and they're getting kind of tapped over and over again, they're burned out, and it's causing people to disengage and lose faith in the process. And that's a problem because, as I said at the top, our paper is arguing that we really need these organizations to work. They really need to be effectively including their stakeholders. Okay, so now I think I've left myself some time to talk through solutions. Next slide. I've pretty much covered that, so we can keep going. So what is the solution we're putting forward? Again, we are adapting Alicia Lovejoy's own call for fair process in her own research and work. What is fair process? It's an organizational management theory that came out of the corporate world. Alicia was the first to apply it in a multi-stakeholder initiative context, and we are doing the same. What's really interesting about fair process is, as the name implies, it's not just looking at outcomes. It's saying that for organizations to motivate people to participate and to feel like they have buy-in to solutions, the decision-making process within organizations is really important. So it's basically, fair process is saying it's just as important how you arrive at the outcomes as the outcomes themselves. And as it says here, it's a recognition that the quality of organizational success is not solely determined by the quality of decisions, but also how those decisions are made and implemented. Next slide. Okay, so we put forward 3 steps for an adapted fair process model, and I'm really excited that we have such a great panel today to talk through how this might look in practice. We really see the report as a starting point of a conversation, and we're putting forward suggestions, but so much of this in detail is really going to need to be hammered out within MSIs and amongst suppliers and brands and retailers and the staff of MSIs. So I'm excited to really see where the conversation takes us today. Okay, so the 3 principles of adapted fair process. First, acknowledgement and reduction of bias. Second, equitable engagement in decision making. And last, transparency around the process. Okay, so first, next slide. All right, so acknowledgement and reduction of bias. What we're recommending here, and there's a lot more detail in the report, is that what we found is there was a tendency for MSIs in their, their public-facing messaging and their mission statements to present themselves as already inclusive. We're asking them instead to acknowledge that there is this inequity, there is a really big problem with unequal stakeholder engagement, and to really just acknowledge this head on. That means taking this report as a starting point, but continuing the conversation with your stakeholders, with suppliers, launching a dialogue and launching a plan. This would also include, at the very minimum, a commitment to remediation in safe spaces. We mentioned in the report several instances of bias and harm that were never accounted for. And MSI simply need to do better to take account for those situations. Okay, next slide. All right, so equitable engagement in decision making. This is about moving beyond a seat at the table. There's been a lot of work done to increase the number of manufacturers in MSIs, and it's not enough. And it's because of a lot of it has to do with these structural factors that we mentioned. We recommend that MSIs need to more directly address the resource gap, for example, the cultural biases that people are bringing into these organizations that engage stakeholders, excuse me, from all around the world. Some of the suggestions we make is finding new ways to amplify supplier voices, recognizing that MSI activity can be a huge strain on manufacturers. We also recommend that MSIs build on this work to prototype inclusive decision-making processes and ways of working. We mentioned a few examples of where some of the MSIs are already trying to do this. But equitable engagement and decision-making, would also include prioritizing, addressing the burden that standards and certifications have on a supply chain, because it's one of the main reasons why there aren't the resources manufacturers need to invest in sustainability, and why they don't have the resources to show up to participate in MSIs to begin with. And the final step is, and this might be the hardest thing, but if manufacturers are allowed to co-create solutions within MSIs, that may also mean the fundamental strategies and goals of these organizations change, and people need to be open to that being the outcome. Okay, last slide. Transparency. In sustainable fashion, we talk about transparency all the time. We are building on that call and saying we also need transparency around decision-making processes, especially within organizations as powerful and influential as MSIs. Disclosing how decision-making works to your stakeholders is one of the main ways that people feel like they understand the process behind something. They want to understand that it was fair, and they want to understand the rationale behind how an organization arrived at a conclusion. We also are advocating for people to implement new self-assessment models. So evaluating how well you're doing with all of these principles that we outlined. And then finally, publicly reporting on progress. So, and I see I'm right at time. So why does this matter? You know, we hope that MSIs and everybody here today engages with these questions, not just because it's what's fair. Yes, of course, it is what, including manufacturers, considering they are so critical to achieving sustainability in the supply chain. We hope that MSIs and the whole industry does this because it's what's effective. It creates better strategies. And Kim, I ran out of time getting to the calls to action for different stakeholders. Maybe we can do that in the discussion.
That's okay, actually. I was going to say, why don't you just run through them quickly at a high level because they are important for the discussion, and then we'll move to the discussion.
Okay, I thought I was doing okay on time. Okay, so
you are. You're fine.
Okay. All right, so we have put out calls to action for all stakeholders in our community. So suppliers, you know, we of course we do not want to downplay the structural barriers that contribute to supplier exclusion. But we also call on suppliers to advocate for their own position as co-creators in sustainability rather than just merely implementing these standards that are passed down to them. Kim, I think that you wrote this line in the report, and I love it, which is that this requires vulnerability and informal human-to-human conversation. So we are calling on people to come out of their defensive corners, to talk to each other as people, and to try to really open up dialogue and come up with solutions. Next slide. Also, brands and retailers, we hope that they take up this call to action. You know, when they see that MSIs are not including manufacturers, to stand beside manufacturers and call for more inclusion. We also are asking them to advocate for convergence of sustainability standards, which also means dropping their own proprietary standards, tools, and frameworks, acknowledging that this is just holding everything back. I'm not going to go through all of the other things on the slide, it's too much, but you guys can read it on your own. Academia, there's a lot of research on MSIs, but we are calling on more research on the relationship between fair process and MSIs, as well as how structural and power imbalances impact stakeholders' ability to engage. Next slide. Legislators really need to be aware that multi-stakeholder initiatives, although they aspire to be inclusive, they might not actually represent the entire industry. Policymakers really need to understand and make sure that all primary stakeholders are engaged within or outside of MSIs. Next slide. And advocacy organizations can also play a role. Several groups already kind of track MSI activity, but we are calling on them to evaluate supplier engagement and to ask for more inclusive and transparent practices, holding them accountable for their engagement strategies. And I will leave it at that and pass it back over to you, Kim.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for the presentation. So I'm going to invite everybody else to turn their cameras on again, and we're going to move into the discussion. And then, as I said, we'll do a little bit of discussion, and then we'll try and leave some time at the end for audience Q&A. So do go ahead and start putting your questions in the Q&A box, and we'll do our best to get to them. Excuse me. Let me just see. Everyone's got their cameras on? Yes. Okay. So I want to actually start with Alicio. And if Rubia, could you go to the next slide? We're going to keep this slide up on the screen for just a minute so that you guys, as the audience, have a chance, can reference it as we talk. And then after a little bit, we'll take it off screen so that we can see everyone's faces nice and big. But Alicia, you, as has been mentioned, were really the first person to adapt fair process theory and suggest that it might be helpful in resolving some of these tensions that manifest within fashion's MSIs. And the report really tries to apply your work to more MSIs beyond just Cascale, which was the focus of your research. And I'm curious to hear, also because this is an industry-facing report, so we tried to make it really practical. We took these abstract principles that you see here on screen: acknowledgement and reduction of bias, equitable engagement and decision-making, and transparency. We took these kind of abstract concepts and we broke it down into steps. This is how you do it. And as Elizabeth said, some of them still need to be, I think, hammered out and can only be hammered out sort of internally within these MSIs. But what do you think? How did we do? Do they resonate with you? And very curious to hear your thoughts.
Thank you, Kim, and thank you, Elizabeth, for the content. I think it's incredible to see this report come to life and expand on the research that I did. I think it's also really important to acknowledge that there is a huge body of literature, both on MSIs and on fair process, and the piece that I did was try and link those together. So I just want to acknowledge Kim and Corbone, who came up with fair process, but they also, as academics do, build on procedural justice. So I think it's important to recognize that we're using a lot of expertise here. But I think the principles resonate. They have built on what I proposed, but I don't think they have differed in direction too much. And also the proposal that I made didn't actually differ that much from the proposal of Kim and Morbone, who looked at fair process within a singular organization. And I think the reason for that is that the principles are important because it's where people are engaged, and people generally want similar things, whether you're employed by one individual or whether you're engaged in an MSI. People would like to have their voice heard. They would like to understand the rules of the games in which they're engaging, and they would like to have an environment where there is no bias or less bias. So I think those are why it's so applicable, and it's coming up again and again in different ways. I think I just wanted to touch on a couple of other things that I wanted to draw out of what Elizabeth and you have shared, Kim, if that's okay. I think something really important for me when I started to do this research was that we think of MSIs as a group of businesses. But in actual fact, in the day-to-day activities, MSIs are groups of individuals. There are groups of individual staff, and there are groups of individuals that represent businesses. And that is why, when you look at it through that perspective, you understand why fair process is so important and why actually process can matter as much as outcomes. The largest MSI that I can think of is the United Nations, and which individuals, as we see with the US, are representative in those meetings is going to massively change impacts for us all. So I think when we start to think about individuals, we start to understand why fair process may be an enabler of more effective decision-making and more aligned activities. And I think on that note, I want to say that I intentionally stayed quite broad in my studies with the principles of fair process because I believe that they are principles and they need to be designed collectively in the context that they will be applied. So I think you have gone a step further in the report to flesh those out and inspire. But what I would really encourage anybody witnessing this or reading this report to do is not to please draw off a page, because what they call for is consultation. So please, if you're going to look at the principles of fair process, consult those that will be engaged in that process and design what will work within that environment. And that, I think, to my final point, will say, I believe that these principles, as I've mentioned, relate to the way that people interact with each other. In an MSI context, that's really high stakes because the MSIs we're talking about can leverage and direct millions of pounds worth of activity and impact. But the principles, I think, can be applied more broadly. So workers' rights, workers want to be engaged, people want agency, and they want a say in their futures and what's impacting them. So I will pause there and let me know, Kim, if there's anything I missed. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Alicio. And I'm actually going to turn the floor to Noreen and Alberto and Trisha to kind of ask you guys the same question. We have these principles. We've tried to translate them into steps. As people who have engaged in these multi-stakeholder organizations on the manufacturing side in various capacities over the years, what do you think? Do these principles, do these steps resonate with you? Do you think they would address exclusion in these settings? And maybe Noreen, I'll start with you, and then Trisha, and then Alberto.
Yes, thank you, Kim. My answer to first response to your question would be, yeah, these principles do resonate with us. And as a supplier, of course, and we've obviously, Elizabeth and you have talked about what the report lays out. One of the things we as suppliers, obviously, these 4 MSIs are, um, one of the a few of the key MSIs that suppliers are heavily affected by. So we as suppliers also have to think about in terms of how do we go forward from here. When we say we are excluded, yes, we are, but what is it as suppliers that we can do to lean in? Because we say that these MSIs are, the way they are structured, they cater to to brands and retailers, but they do not necessarily listen to the voices of the people who are affected by it. So how we are affected by opportunities and places for safe spaces. When you talk about, the report talks about vulnerability on part of the suppliers. So the availability of that safe space is very critical for us, because we talk about these power dynamics all the time between the brands, retailers, and the industry. So a lot of time, other than the fact that there are very few suppliers who are engaged in these platforms, so you're pretty stretched. But if we internally within the suppliers, I'll talk about ourselves, discuss what are and where we can leverage and seek more participation from our side into these MSIs. One of our biggest concern is that the lack of that safe space. So whatever we bring to the table, would we be able to say what we want to say without any repercussions in terms of the power dynamics that keep on playing at the back of our minds. So this is one key thing at times that keeps us from, as suppliers, generally speaking, away from this. Other than, we talk about lack of resources and time and all of that. But the question that would come to us, for example, in our minds would be that, what if we free up the time, free up the resources and all, and we go and participate, but would we be heard? Would it be worth it? But then the thing is, like I said earlier as well, we are extremely affected in particular by 4 of these MSIs. So we do need to lean in as suppliers. And maybe there's something we collectively as suppliers need to discuss and in terms of give our input to these MSIs, how they can get us together. Make those spaces for us to discuss all of those things. So we do have a role, and there is no way, I think, given the legislation and everything that the industry is going through and will go through in future. So the time has gone past where we can just sit back and, being dictated to. We have to lean in. So definitely.
Thank you. Thank you, Noreen. And I'm going to hand over to Trisha and then Alberto. So again, the question is, what do you think of these principles? Do they resonate? How have we done in terms of translating into practical steps?
Yeah, thanks, Kim. I think overall the principles, we have to admit we are going through an industry transition right now. So we have to look at new ways of working, and that's not just brands and suppliers, but it's also MSIs. So I think these principles really lay us up for a long-term vision of how the industry has to work, and not just getting by on short-term, just to get from one season to the next. So I completely agree with what Noreen had mentioned. And I think another point I just want to raise, because I think it's been wonderful to see the response to the report since it was released on Monday, comments coming through on LinkedIn as well as press coverage. I think we also have to acknowledge that the MSIs were open to this discussion and this investigation. being a bit vulnerable to kind of look at ways to improve. And I think within the process of working on this report, it's also good to acknowledge that there needs to be this openness within the MSIs, and the fact that they were able to have these conversations. So I think that part is important too. Within the model, I think it's very clear that whatever angle or however you're coming to the table, that this can be used in steps going forward. Because I kind of look at our industry, it's a river that keeps flowing, and it's a big ship, and new people are getting on that ship at different times. So it's great to have these ground rules of how to work within fair process.
Thank you, Tricia. And Alberto.
Okay, well, let's see, much has been said. So I think this deep dive is an incredibly powerful tool for MSIs. The adaptive fair process model offers, I think, a solid foundation for addressing the exclusion that manufacturers often feel, which then directly impacts on their engagement. We know that we are a supplier, we know how that feels like. And I also think that this issue is really not new. It's kind of already well acknowledged by some of the MSIs, but I'm not suggesting here any malintent. Suppliers exclusions, if that happens and when that happens, typically I think arises from other competing priorities rather than poor judgment. However, the time to address this issue is really now. The transformation happening in our industry, which is a real deep transformation, makes closer collaboration and mutual understanding more critical than ever. So this paper and its principle provide clear, actionable pathways for creating the change that we all need. That's my perspective.
Thank you, Alberto. And in the interest of time, I'm going to move to the audience Q&A. But before we do that, I just want to give you all a chance to respond to each other. I mean, is there anything, that any of you guys, that anyone said that you feel like you really want to respond to? And there's no pressure, you don't have to. But if you'd like to, this is your moment. No? Okay. Well, we have a lot of questions coming in. We're going to do our best to get to them. The first one I'm going to, let's see. The first one I'm going to look at is how do you handle stakeholders' intimidation? It's a question from Laura, I apologize. How do you handle stakeholders' intimidation in speaking up in group settings? And I don't know does anyone particularly want to take this question? Because I know the report has a point of view on this, and Elizabeth could probably speak to that, but I don't know if Alicia or Tricia or Alberto or Noreen, you also have thoughts. And there's no pressure.
Sorry,
yeah,
Kim,
go ahead.
can you come again?
The question is, how do you handle stakeholder intimidation in speaking up in group settings? And maybe actually I'm gonna put Noreen on the spot here, because your answer kind of alluded to this, I think. And then Elizabeth, and if anyone else wants to add, you can. But your answer, I think, alluded to this, because one of the things you said when you spoke just now was about creating spaces for manufacturers to talk to each other and building that confidence that, oh, I'm not the only one who feels this way or is experiencing this. And maybe that's part of, maybe giving manufacturers more spaces to connect with each other and to talk is part of that. But I don't know. What do you think?
I thank you for putting me on the spot for this. But and obviously we face this situation, to be honest. It's not that we don't. It can get very tricky because because of the power dynamics, because of your vulnerabilities, you don't want to stick out as being the troublemaker, or so we definitely lean on each other. I know we do a lot of and not necessarily just suppliers. we may lean on, some of, other folks in the periphery. But while in the moment, it can become very challenging. I don't have a right away an answer to that, because it can vary from situation to situation, how intimidating it is, what the conversation or the particular space is like. You do not want to offend, but you also want to still articulate to your point. One of the things I have learned is that and sometimes you're able to do it, is to take a step back, because this is a long-term conversation. You don't have to win it that day. So me in my individual capacity, I may step back and say, okay, today is not the day, but how do I next time make sure that I don't know, better prepared. I have maybe at times it may require a side conversation before that actual event, or similar situation I think may happen in future. So how do you prep for that? So right now it's more or less I think tactful diplomacy. That's the best based on what I individually have experienced. And I do believe that it's a long term. You don't have to win it that day. You learn from it, you get out, and you come back in.
Kim, I would be happy to
Yeah,
add
go
a
ahead.
bit. As previously working in a supplier, I have been in those environments, and I think I agree with you, Noreen, but I think there is a responsibility, and that's where some of the principles come in place, to create safe environments where people feel free to challenge, and that challenging each other isn't going to be detrimental to the future of a person or an individual's career, or to a company's business perspectives, because ultimately those are the reasons that we feel uncomfortable to challenge. And I think it's something, if we really as a community want to come out with effective solutions and move forward, we all need to get more comfortable in challenging each other's ideas so we can come out with the best versions of those. And that means creating safe spaces where there aren't repercussions on questioning somebody's perspectives.
Thank you, Alicia.
Thank you.
Anybody else have thoughts on this?
Can I just add one thing? I just wonder if, since this came up a couple of times in the Q&A, if, especially because people are using the term intimidation and I think maybe harassment, that indicates to me that maybe some of what we touched on in relation to this in the report is just the tip of the iceberg, which means that MSIs just really need to do a lot more work to understand what their stakeholders are experiencing and to take these complaints seriously. You know, that's just one part of our report, but I think it indicates a much larger problem.
Thank you. And I saw Trisha and Alberto, you also have.
Yeah, I think also within every MSI, there is a representative on the board from the supplier side of the industry. And so if there's any hesitation, working through that representative is another way of doing it. As Noreen mentioned, where can you also build a collective consensus of opinion within other suppliers is another way to handle it. But I think, you know, to the point that Alicia and Melissa, MSIs need to also say, okay, now we're going to give the floor over to suppliers and welcome that voice.
Yeah, I was waiting, Kim, ladies first. So, but there is something I have to say about this, and probably this is one of the most sophisticated challenges that come, through the paper. This is actually through within the MSI framework, but beyond that too. And as the paper suggests, the principles may need to be tailored to address specific regional, cultural context to be really fully effective. And that requires not only different ways of working, but I think a degree of mutual understanding and empathy that hasn't been shown so far, and it is largely unknown in our industry, I think. So it's actually an opportunity for everybody to progress in that field.
Thank you, everyone. I'm gonna go. Well, actually, last thing I would say too is I think that the step in the report on remediation is also a really important part of this, and the transparency around what the rules are. I mean, in my view, fair process is just like a fancy way of saying the rules for rulemaking. and that there's transparency around what the rules are, because that's then what you can go back to when these instances happen. There are two questions in here, and I'm going to paraphrase in the interest of time. One's from Tamika and another from Antonio about, manufacturers aren't the only stakeholders. There are a lot of other stakeholders that need to be part of these conversations. And I'm going to put this question to Elizabeth, because I know it's something we talked about when we originally made the scope of the report. And what are your thoughts there?
I mean, I think it absolutely, the paper's findings are relevant to all stakeholders within the MSI ecosystem. I think it's particularly relevant to those who face structural barriers to participation. So, for example, workers in the supply chain. Fair process, and Alicia can build on this, but it's absolutely relevant to any stakeholder. It's a universal, holistic solution. So again, I think the findings are about stakeholder engagement broadly. And we do mention in the paper that we're looking at stakeholder engagement through the lens of manufacturers, because it is the Transformers Foundation report, but it has broader implications.
Thanks, Elizabeth. There's a question in here from, and I'm going to mispronounce it, I apologize, but Aishwarya. And the question is, the fashion system is built on racism and exploitation. The power imbalance is witnessed in many touch points in the buyer-supplier dynamic. The hegemony that has existed for decades is a big barrier to supplier voice. Would be great to tackle this power imbalance and purchasing practices that lead to suppliers feeling voiceless. Now, this is more of a comment, but the question that I actually want to pull out from this comment is about purchasing practices. Transformers has also done a report on unethical purchasing practices. And what I wanted to one of the points that Elizabeth mentioned in her presentation is being open to different solutions, and inclusion of manufacturers might lead to different solutions being pursued. And I think for me, like, one of the questions that this report raises is, why aren't purchasing practices on the agenda the same way as other issues? And is that perhaps a symptom of who's had a voice in shaping the agenda? So that was something that I wanted to and I don't know if any of the other panelists have any thing that they want to add on this comment or question.
I
Nori.
Comment, and Kim, you and I have talked about this a few times. I think generally speaking, as suppliers, it's not just the MSIs. Suppliers have not been actively part of generally any discussion, so to speak, in terms of especially when you compare it with the brands, retailers, and also while the power dynamics exist and have been existing for a while now, but I think now more than ever, we suppliers need to, push ourselves, because this is affecting us beyond, whatever we think our threshold is. Because some of these issues are global issues. These issues are not particular to a supplier, a particular region, and all. These are global issues. And as suppliers, we are obviously in different geographies. For brands, if I may, it is relatively, because they've been traditionally more interested and invested in this. So MSIs, platforms, tools, you name it, have been set up that have responded more to their needs. So while we sit back and criticize and say, I mean, those criticisms and those experiences are valid, they are real. But having said that, is there a space, or is there, in terms of way forward, where suppliers find those spaces for themselves? I'm just, because there's a reason why this legislations and all those are kicking in, because whatever has been there has not worked. So regulations, etc., are telling the industry to go back and relook and redesign and all of that. So there is definitely a big, huge incentive for us suppliers to go back and try and see how we can be more collective about it. So earlier, like Elizabeth and you in the report itself, we are saying there's that 8, 10, 12 suppliers, a dozen, few dozen at best, who are participating or being heard at that global level. So we also need to find a way to, so maybe these MSIs can help us find that collective space, get us together. I'm just thinking out loud that where we can have those safe spaces and where and then we can collectively articulate, okay, this is what we think can be done. And this is what we can put in terms of resources into the bigger pool. So, and that would be just my 2 cents.
Thank you, Noreen. I want to, we're out of time, but I'm going to open the floor to the speakers if there's any final things that you'd really like to say. But before I do that, for anybody who does have to drop off, thank you so much for being here. I really encourage you, please download the report, read it. Yes, there's the QR code if you want to download it. And I'll open the floor. Any final thoughts from any of the people here today? Elizabeth, Alicia, Trisha, Alberto, Noreen.
I'll just add, I hope it's the beginning of a rich conversation about this topic, and I really appreciate everybody being here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Final thoughts from any of our other speakers today?
Thanks again for everyone and their contributions towards this.
Yeah, I would say thank you for doing this deep dive. And as Elizabeth said, hopefully it's the start of conversation and the start of a focus not only on outcomes, which are super important in this space, but on how we reach them, the process too.
Right. And thank you. And I would encourage all suppliers to read this report as well and disseminate to the extent possible that individually I can. So,
well, I know a lot of suppliers really wanted to come to this webinar, which surprised me because I thought, oh, they already know all of this, you know, like they're not going to be interested in reading this report. And I know there were a lot who registered. They're like, we're going to register so we get the recording. But Alberto, no pressure, but any final thoughts from you?
Yeah, well, what I feel like saying is that within this, this report was a true eye opener for me, and there are a lot of really good suggestion, directions, guidelines about sustainability and social initiatives. And without shifts and changes, many of these initiatives risk remaining superficial and disconnected from those who can make the biggest impact. And I really hope I'm not offending anybody, but suppliers are the ones that can really make the biggest impact.
Thank you. And so with that, we'll close the webinar. I know there were a lot of questions we didn't get to. We'll do our best to circle back and respond to some of them by email. But thank you very much again for being here. And thank you to all of the speakers. And please download the report. All right. Have a nice evening, morning, wherever you're calling from. And until next time.
Bye-bye.